caregiver unit for my sister who, um, at 24 years old, while she was in labor, suffered a ruptured brain aneurysm that left her with multiple disabilities. My mother was the primary caregiver. My sister was uninsured. And it was the women, always the women in our family and community who supported us. The church ladies, yeah, the church ladies showed up. The women in, we had like a neighborhood center, and they would watch my sister. We can afford adult daycare, so they would watch my sister. This was after she had recovered, because it was a long recovery. And even my mom's supervisor, who allowed her to adjust her work schedule so she could take my sister to appointments. And it was like, because I was young, me and my siblings, my mother was she was a single mother of 4. And so it was like when she was working, we were, the caregivers. So that was my introduction into informal caregiving work. And that's, I didn't fully understand it then, but I knew what it felt like. And then once I started practicing as a nurse, I could, and also started, studying the history of racism in nursing, and really being able to see the racial and gender and class dimensions of it, and how the work is devalued. Nina, you said something last week, and thank you, because I've been like reflecting on this all week. I didn't want to misquote you, but you said, they say care work is important while also telling women you should be doing something else. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times in my career someone has asked me, why didn't I go to medical school instead of nursing? And that question tells you everything. So we are one of the larger panels, and it will also include translation. Phoebe kind of got us caught up, so I need to move us along. Okay, so the format will be very similar to panel 1. Each panelist will be asked a question, and then after we've gone through a round of questions, we'll just open up the floor for discussion. Okay. Premilla Nadasen is the Ann Whitney Olin Professor of History at Barnard College. She has published extensively on the multiple meanings of feminism, alternative labor movements, and grassroots community organizing. Can you talk about labor exploitation in the care and domestic work industry, and how care has become a site of profit extraction?
So thank you very much. I also just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. A little louder. Yes. Okay, how's that? No, I can't. And I also want to thank everyone who did all the work to put this conference together. Maddie, of course. A lot of people behind the scenes as well. The people who are preparing the food that we're eating, the people who are going to clean up after us, the people who are doing care work for some of us so that we can be here today, as well as the intellectual labor. And I especially want to thank my co-panelists. I think it's so important that we're talking about care right now. As I actually rewrote this this morning as I was listening to everybody. So I'm going to shorten what we talked about last week, and I'm going to add a little bit at the end. And unfortunately, this is not the happy panel. But I think that part of what I'm going to talk about is why the grassroots work that all of you are doing is so important. And it's because the care economy and care extraction and care profit is so problematic right now. There has been a resurgence of interest in and valorization of care politics as practice and as ethics, especially over the last few years. But as we all know, and as this will be demonstrated, for the rest of the day and was demonstrated this morning, care is complicated, it's contradictory, and we heard some of the harrowing stories in the last panel. Not everyone is cared for. There is no equal access to care, whether we're talking about state assistance or corporate benefits, or whether we're talking about the ability to purchase care services in the labor market, right? And we also see a profound lack of care in terms of federal politics and international politics, and Palestine is probably one of the most important examples of a complete lack of care. There we go. So care has been a site of labor exploitation and profit extraction in multiple registers. This includes unpaid women's work. It includes the exploitation of low-paid domestic and care workers, and it includes the extraction of profit in the care economy. The crisis of care over the past 30 years is because of a complex set of forces. I'm not going to talk about all of it, but part of it has to do with the dismantling of the welfare state, the falling of wages, attacks on labor, and middle-class women's entry into the labor force. For some people, the crisis of care forebodes a crisis of capitalism. Oh, we only wish so. But I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Please.
I think that the crisis of care is and has been financially beneficial and necessary for capitalism to flourish. In fact, the crisis of care is not new for Black and brown people. For them, it was not a result of neoliberal restructuring over the past 30 years. The lack of care for some people and their crisis of care has been how capitalism has flourished since its inception. And this includes labor exploitation of domestic workers, which of course generates racial and economic inequality and the crisis of care in Black and brown families. The fact that some people have no social supports, the lack of a comprehensive, adequate healthcare system, the shortage of childcare centers, the fact that families are torn apart, the growing unhoused population. These are all crises that I argue capitalism is benefiting from. While some people might say that these are indications of capitalism's failure, I would say that this is what capitalism has intended all along. Capitalism has turned this crisis into financially lucrative opportunity, creating services and products, securing government grants, and working closely with the nonprofit sector. So care has become a site of capital accumulation and a pillar of the US economy and economic growth. The diffuse and decentralized nature of the care economy means there are many layers of profit to be made. So capital makes money off of things like, off of the money that people spend on home health care aides, nursing homes, education, food delivery, child care. And there are more and more corporate firms that are dedicated to meeting these needs. The care economy has benefited from the needs of people with resources and the crisis of social reproduction of the most vulnerable people. And care.com is just one example of that. I'm sure people have heard of care.com. It's an online platform like Uber. It's a private company, and in 2020, it was bought by a US public holding company for $500 million. I'm going to skip a little bit here. And I will also say that the state has been implicated in the care economy and profit extraction from care. The welfare state today is less a source of social support for the needy and a site of profit making for politicians and their friends. Especially since the dismantling in 1996 loosened restrictions on how states can spend money. And so there's been an outsourcing of welfare state responsibilities, public and private partnerships, where public dollars are transferred to the private sector, both profit and nonprofit. Only about 25% of money earmarked for TANF ends up in the hands of families in need. And I want to give two very brief examples. One is in the state of Mississippi. The Mississippi Department of Human Services Director, John Davis, funneled tens of millions of welfare dollars, nearly the entire welfare budget for the state, into a nonprofit run by his friend and supporter. They used this welfare money to enrich themselves, to hire their friends, support pet projects, take fancy vacations, and purchase luxury vehicles. Another example is from a company called Maximus, which is a private for-profit company that has signed contracts with local, state, and federal government agencies across the country. They manage the welfare to work programs, the healthcare exchanges, child support enforcement, those same child care support enforcements that's taking the children away from the women we heard this morning, and job training programs. The net worth of Maximus is $4.5 billion. So I argue that the welfare state today serves as a transfer program from the poor to the wealthy. And it intensifies racial, gender, and economic inequality. It destroys families rather than keeping them together. And so I will just end by saying that I think that we on the left have to really think about our relationship with the state and what we're fighting for and the kind of what our short-term goal is and our long-term goal is. I think one of the more promising programs is a guaranteed annual income, which I know many people here are advocating for and pushing for. And I think a guaranteed annual income will give people autonomy and control.
Thank you, Premilla. I think you really laid out how care work and domestic work remains deeply profitable for those who control it, not those who do it. So I want to stay with the question of labor protections or the lack thereof. Leddy Mozombite Linares is the General Secretary of the Domestic Workers Federation in Peru and the coordinator of the Global Women's Strike Peru. She was instrumental in getting the Peru government to pass a new law protecting the rights of domestic workers. Leddy, would you talk about the working conditions and protective legislation for domestic workers, including a care income?
¿Esta me sacó? Sí. Voy a escuchar yo mismo. Buenos días a todos y a todas.
Good morning, everybody.
Como ya me presentaron, pero quiero presentarme también yo.
I know that I was introduced already, but I'd like to introduce myself too.
Soy Leddy Mozombite Linares, secretaria general de la Federación Nacional de Trabajadoras y Trabajadores del Hogar del Perú. También soy parte de la Huelga Mundial de Mujeres en Perú, pero también soy parte del Sindicato de Trabajadoras Remuneradas y No Remuneradas del Hogar de Lima Metropolitana.
My name is Leddy. ¿Cómo es, perdón, Leddy?
Leddy Mozombite.
Mozombite, okay. I'm part of the National Federation of Domestic Workers in Peru, as well as the Global Strike of Women. And I'm also part of the Union of Workers, Paid and Unpaid Workers in Peru. In the home.
Quiero agradecer a Selma y a Nina y a todas las compañeras de la huelga que han hecho todo el esfuerzo por estar aquí.
I want to thank Nina and everybody else who has been part of the strike for making the effort to be here today.
Estoy muy emocionada porque pensé no venir, porque estaba mucho tiempo mal.
I'm feeling very emotional. I was even thinking about not coming because I haven't been feeling very well.
Además tengo mucho miedo al avión, entonces me preparé y dije que sí, voy, y estoy acá.
I also, I'm very afraid of flying, but I said, you know what, if I'm going, I'm going. So here I am.
He hecho algunas notas y quiero, he hecho unas notas, pero también he aprendido mucho de la huelga, de Nina en especial, y justamente en la mañana yo decía, Nina no me dijo nada, o será que ya he aprendido, o será que ¿qué pasa? Dije. Entonces, aprendí mucho porque yo hablo mucho, no sé sintetizar y aprendí de Nina y me decía que tengo que decir las cosas que debo decir.
So I have some notes here. I've learned a lot from the global women's strike, especially from Nina. I don't, it's hard to summarize the things that I have learned from Nina.
Yo lo que quiero contarles rápido es que vengo desde el sur global de Perú, que actualmente nuestro país está pasando por una situación, por una coyuntura política casi dictatorial, ¿no? Por este gobierno actual que tenemos.
I'm from the global south. I'm from Peru. And right now, our political context is that we're going through a moment that's with a government that's almost a dictatorship.
Pero quiero decirles que la lucha de las trabajadoras del hogar es que no ha empezado ayer, sino nuestra lucha es por años, por siglos, que hemos venido siendo invisibilizadas.
The struggle of domestic workers, it's a struggle that's not only been years, it's been centuries, and we are a group of workers that has been made invisible.
Pero además que las trabajadoras del hogar porque todavía no hemos logrado, sufrimos explotación, discriminación, por este sistema de nuestro país que es machista y explotador.
We as domestic workers have gone through exploitation and discrimination with the system in our country, which is sexist, machista, and exploitative.
Las trabajadoras del hogar hacemos el trabajo del cuidado remunerado, pero también el no remunerado. Mientras que nosotras dejamos a nuestros hijos en nuestra casa, nos vamos a cuidar a otros niños que las familias que nos contratan.
We as domestic workers do both paid and unpaid work. When we leave our homes to do our paid work, we're taking care of the children of people who are paying us while leaving our own children at home.
Por eso es cuando hablaba la exponente anterior, decía que los cuidados es complicado, es contradictorio. Mientras tú cuidas a otros hijos, yo me acuerdo cuando mis hijos eran pequeños, yo les tenía que dejar encerrados para ir a cuidar a otros niños, porque la que habla ha sido trabajadora del hogar desde los 7 años.
¿Desde los 17 dijo?
7.
7, perdón, okay. Entonces, it's a little complicated. That's what I was thinking when I was listening to the other speakers. It's contradictory almost because you leave your own children to take care of other children. And that's what I've been doing. I've been taking care I've been a caretaker since I was 7 years old.
Cuando hablaban de capitalismo, considero que este es el costo del capitalismo que nos da ese trabajo en nuestras espaldas para asumir las mujeres, ¿no? porque nos han hecho creer la sociedad que las mujeres hemos nacido, que es inherente a nosotras como mujeres, tenemos que hacer ese trabajo del cuidado, que lavar y cocinar y planchar y cuidar a los hijos es nuestro trabajo por considerarnos mujeres y además en el caso de las trabajadoras del hogar, porque somos de un sector con poca formación educativa, somos andinas, amazónicas, quechohablantes.
Gracias.
Ahí me quedé.
And I think that's really what the cost of capitalism is, that we have been told, like, we as women, these are our jobs, right? We have to cook, we have to clean, we have to iron the clothes, we have to take care of the children. And also for us in particular, we're women from the Andes, we're women from the Amazon.
En el Perú, el 97% de trabajadoras del hogar todavía trabajamos en condiciones informales, en condiciones precarias.
In Peru, 97% of women work in informal, high-risk labor situations.
Pero la lucha de nosotras no es solamente por más sueldos, por más vacaciones, por más CTS, también nuestra lucha es cultural.
Our struggle is not only for a higher salary, for vacation, for our rights, but it's also a cultural struggle.
Porque la sociedad, los empleadores tienen en su cerebro que nosotras somos como de su propiedad, porque como nos pagan un sueldo, ellos deciden a qué hora vamos a comer, qué cosa vamos a comer, a qué hora vamos a descansar y tampoco podemos ir a estudiar.
Because the employers a lot of times have in their head that since they pay us, that they own us and they're going to decide what time we eat, when are we going to eat, what are we going to do, and that's how they control us.
Hay una relación de poder, ¿no? Porque como ellos pagan, ellos tienen la plata, entonces nosotras somos hay una herencia colonial en el Perú que somos la servidumbre, ¿no? Que en la pandemia, por ejemplo, se evidenció claramente que las trabajadoras del hogar nos encontrábamos en condiciones de una precariedad total, ¿no?
This is the legacy of colonialism in Peru, too. There is this mindset, and especially since the pandemic, we have felt ourselves in even more unstable situations since the pandemic.
Porque hemos sido despedidas, muchas trabajadoras del hogar que hemos trabajado años en una casa, 40, 60 años, porque hemos sido mayores y sin ningún beneficio, sin ninguna seguridad social, y muchas han trabajado gratis, sin ningún sueldo, y entendiendo que en la pandemia todos estaban en casa, ¿no? Teníamos que hacer esa labor del cuidado indirecto, también el directo, porque teníamos que ayudar a... Ya.
Gracias, gracias. Se emociona mucho, ¿verdad? It's hard when you get going. There's been cases where women who have been working somewhere for 40 or 60 years are fired just because they've now gotten old and they don't get any type of benefits, any type of compensation when they're fired. And especially since the pandemic, this has been happening because, remember during the pandemic, we were in our homes, so it was a different situation.
Y teníamos que también ayudar las tareas de los niños, de los hijos de los empleadores. Pero las trabajadoras del hogar no nos hemos quedado ahí de brazos cruzados, todo lo contrario, estamos organizadas en sindicatos, en federaciones, en la huelga.
And so we're taking care of the children of our employers. But we have to remember, we haven't just stood there with our arms crossed doing nothing, right? We have gotten together, we've organized ourselves, we've gone on strike.
Entonces hemos logrado dos normas importantes para las trabajadoras del hogar. Uno es el convenio 189, el otro es la ley actual que tenemos, la 31047.
So we have achieved two important things for domestic workers. One is the number 189, the regulation of the International Organization of Work, and the other one is law number 31047.
Yo voy a hablar de la ley, no sé cuánto tiempo tengo. Lo que hemos logrado las trabajadoras del hogar es que nos reconozcan como trabajadoras, como cualquier otro trabajador.
I'm not sure I don't remember exactly how many years we've been with this law, but what the law does is that it recognizes us as workers, just like any other work.
Porque la sociedad, los empleadores dicen que somos parte de la familia. Un momento, no somos parte de la familia. Somos trabajadoras como cualquier otro trabajador. No somos las ayudantas, no somos las ahijadas, que eso han puesto en el cerebro para explotarnos más, nos han hecho creer eso.
Society a lot of times says that, oh, we're just part of the family. That's not true. We're workers, just like any other worker. We're not there to help. We're not the assistant. We're there working.
Por eso es que con esta ley, lo que hemos logrado, esta ley no ha sido fácil, esta ley nos ha costado mucho trabajo, muchas campañas. Hemos hecho una campaña a la que le hemos denominado Cocinando una nueva ley.
We've done a lot of work to achieve these laws. It hasn't been easy. We've done campaigns. We did a campaign that was called Cooking Up a New Law.
Esta campaña ha llamado la atención a los medios de comunicación, a los congresistas, a las autoridades, a las propias trabajadoras del hogar.
This campaign was directed to raise the attention of members of Congress, of the media, of domestic workers ourselves as well.
Porque tenemos una olla bien grande y con un letrero que dice Cocinando una nueva ley con derechos.
So we had a really big pot, and we put a sign on the pot that said, we're cooking up a new law with our rights.
Y con muchos letreros, hicimos varios letreros. No he traído un letrero, lo hubiera traído. Me han dado tanto miedo que no íbamos a ingresar a Estados Unidos, entonces no hemos traído nada casi, ni un material. Entonces decíamos un contrato escrito, derecho a la maternidad, y nos íbamos por la calle bailando, entramos al Congreso, le hacíamos bailar al congresista y le decíamos que cocine y que metes los letreros ahí y que lo batan con un cucharón.
So I wanted to bring some signs to show you, but I just, it kind of slipped my mind, and especially we were so worried we weren't even going to be able to get into the United States, so I don't have so many materials to show you, but we had the big pot like this with a lot of signs. We were dancing. We went up to the members of Congress, and we had them dancing too, and it was all there to stand up for our rights.
Pero la gente, los trabajadores de otros movimientos sindicatos que agrupan nuestra central, pensábamos que estábamos llevando una olla de comida. Y se acercaban pensando que era comida, pero ahí nosotros le agarrábamos para hacerles bailar y cocinar.
And there were people there from other organizations, other unions. They thought that we were actually cooking food. So they would come up thinking they were going to get food, but we would invite them to dance with us and to participate.
Bueno, así hemos hecho esa gran campaña que nos han entrevistado a nivel internacional. Era una novedad de lograr esta campaña. Fuimos a las universidades. El propio movimiento sindical nos empezó a tomar en cuenta porque estar también afiliada a una central sindical no es fácil. Nos ha costado luchar para que nos reconozcan como trabajadoras, como cualquier otro trabajador.
So this was a campaign that we did on an international level, and it's been difficult. And actually, we even have gotten recognition from the union movement in our country as well. There's a union, like a central labor council, and it has not been easy for them to recognize us as part of their movement, but we've achieved that as well.
Esta ley que hemos logrado en el Perú es la mejor ley sin desmerecer la lucha de otros países a nivel de Latinoamérica y de Europa. Esta ley, por ejemplo, habla del derecho a la maternidad que nunca tuvimos las trabajadoras del hogar, que apenas nos embarazamos nos despedían.
This law that we have in Peru is one of the best laws in all of the countries in struggle in Latin America. For example, in this law, we have the right to our maternity, which we never had before. Before, we would get pregnant and we would get fired immediately.
También habla el derecho a la sindicalización, que es la libertad sindical. sea, derecho a organizarnos en un sindicato, derecho a la huelga, derecho a la negociación colectiva, que nos podemos sentar con los empleadores a negociar, pero en el Perú todavía no nos podemos organizar con los empleadores porque no están organizados.
We also have the right to union membership, to freedom as a union member. We can organize collectively, we can go on strike, we can negotiate collectively, sit down with the employer, but in Peru we have not completely achieved this right yet.
También tenemos derecho al contrato escrito y a no verbal. Lo que estamos luchando es que el contrato verbal, que se formalice en nuestra relación laboral. Para nosotros es importante la ley porque ahí en el contrato escrito va el nombre del empleador, la dirección del empleador. ¿Por qué es importante la dirección y el nombre del empleador? Porque muchas veces cuando contrata a una trabajadora del hogar, mandan a trabajar a otra casa que es de la familia, del hijo o del padre. Por eso es importante nosotros que luchemos por el contrato escrito, porque en el contrato escrito dice el horario. Voy a hablar un poco más.
So we also have a right to a written contract, not a verbal contract. This is important because it formalizes the relationship. The contract needs to have the name of the employer, the address. Why is the address important? Well, a lot of times they might hire us, but then they send us to work in somebody else's house, somebody else in the family, a child, a parent. So we need that written down. In the contract is also our schedule. Adelante.
También tenemos derecho al refrigerio. Porque las trabajadoras del hogar siempre tenemos que tomar nuestros alimentos después que los empleadores comen o lo que les sobra. Nunca nos sentamos, siempre comemos a cualquier hora. Por eso muchas veces las trabajadoras del hogar tienen muchas enfermedades como la gastritis y la tuberculosis.
We also have a right to a meal break. A lot of times what happens with domestic workers is that we eat only after our employers eat, or we just eat whatever's left over. So we end up eating at different times of day, and that can often cause us to get sick. Many domestic workers have gastritis or tuberculosis.
También tenemos derecho a 30 días de vacaciones, a gratificación, Navidad y fiestas patrias, un mes, la compensación por tiempo de servicio, que es la CTS, trabajo 8 horas, las demás son horas extras.
We also have other rights, like we get 30 days of vacation, a full month, compensation called CTS. Our workday is 8 hours. Any hours beyond that are additional.
Además, esta ley habla de 3 modalidades. Trabajo con residencia, que antes se decía cama adentro. Trabajo sin residencia, que ahora es antes se decía cama afuera. Trabajo por horas y por días. Todas estas 3 modalidades, todos tienen estos beneficios y contrato escrito.
The contract also, or now with this new law, it recognizes 3 different forms of working. In-home work, meaning you sleep there, out-of-home work, meaning you don't sleep there, and work hourly and daily work. All of this is recognized in the contract.
Mañana seguiré hablando de la ley, pero quiero hablar hoy por qué nosotras, la Federación, ahora está constituyendo sindicatos de trabajadoras remuneradas y no remuneradas del hogar. Tenemos 2 sindicatos porque consideramos que organizadas las mujeres vamos a lograr que los cuidados en el mundo se reconozcan y que sean visibles y que reconozcan el aporte económico, social y cultural que hacemos en los países que realizamos ese trabajo.
So I could keep talking about the law, but I also want to mention why in the Federation we're working with unions. We have unions for workers who are unpaid, both paid and unpaid. And this is how we've been able to achieve that care workers, women across the world, are recognized for our contribution, our economic, social, and cultural contribution in the countries where we work.
En mi país se está debatiendo mucho un sistema nacional de cuidados. Debaten las feministas, debaten el Estado. Estuvimos en una reunión que nos convocaron.
In my country, there's a lot of debate right now about a care system, a system of care. Feminists are debating, the state is debating. We were in a meeting that they called us to.
Pero, ¿qué dicen las feministas y otras organizaciones? Que las mujeres no se realizan profesionalmente porque están realizando el trabajo del cuidado, por cuidar los hijos, la casa, no son profesionales y no se han realizado. O sea, un sistema nacional de cuidados traería oportunidades de trabajo. ¿Y qué decimos nosotras?
So what are the feminists and the different organizations saying? They're saying that women are not able to move forward professionally because they're doing work at home. They're saying that that's not professional. But the national care system would provide opportunities.
¿Pero qué decimos nosotras, las trabajadoras del hogar, las mujeres de la clase trabajadora?
I can't right now, sorry.
Mientras una mujer profesional va a salir a trabajar, ¿y quién se va a quedar en su casa haciendo todas esas labores? Va a ser otra mujer de otra clase social, una trabajadora del hogar que va a lavar, que va a cocinar y encima le van a pagar un sueldo precario, por no decir miserable. Ella se va a realizar económicamente, profesionalmente, y la trabajadora del hogar, ¿qué?
So, but what happens when a woman leaves her home, maybe even close by to go work, there's another woman who's from a different social class who's going to be cleaning, cooking, and they're paying that woman, in many cases, a very low salary, a miserable salary, while the other woman goes to move forward economically and professionally.
Por eso hay todo un debate. Cuando nos convocan, nosotras, la vez pasada estuvimos, no están las mujeres, por ejemplo, que hacen las ollas comunes, la red de ollas, que cocinan alimento en algunos distritos, que también es una forma de hacer cuidados hacia la alimentación, las mujeres andinas, las rurales, que gracias a ellas tenemos las frutas, todo lo que se alimenta. Entonces ellas no están. Pero el Estado dice, ¿por qué si hablamos de las mujeres andinas es un problema grande? Mejor hay que dejarles ahí por un lado, nos vamos a complicar.
This comes up also, like there's another kind of worker, women who they cook, they distribute food in a lot of the districts of our country. They're Andean women. It's because of them that we have fruits and a lot of different foods. But the state will say, oh no, because they're Andean women, we're going to not think about this. It's too complicated. We're going to just leave that over there.
Bueno, como ya cumplí mi hora para seguir hablando, yo quiero agradecer una vez más por estar aquí y escuchar todo ese trabajo que vienen realizando ustedes, mujeres luchadoras, guerreras, grandiosas, inteligentes, y seguimos construyendo así desde la distancia para lograr algún día ser libres, digo yo, y que los cuidados sea un trabajo como cualquier otro. Gracias.
So I think I've now gone over my time, but I just want to again thank everybody for being here. Everybody here is intelligent, a warrior, and I want us to continue fighting across all our countries so that we can truly, as I would say, be free.
Leddy, thank you for coming despite feeling unwell. You gave us a lot to come back to in discussion. I'm going to move us, Virginia. Yeah, Virginia Eubanks is an investigative reporter and associate professor of political science at the University at Albany, SUNY. For 2 decades, she has worked in community technology and economic justice movements. Can you discuss what your recent work about kinship care and automation has revealed?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for all the folks who made these days possible, but also all of you who have come here to engage in what I think is this incredibly important conversation. I started out actually as just a member of the audience and was like, I'm really excited to be coming to your conference. And they were like, do you want to talk? And I was like, oh yeah, I do have some things to say about this. So I'm gonna mostly, thank you, I'm gonna mostly talk about some of my new work. Some of you might know, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile Police and Punish the Poor. And in that book, I talk a lot about how new technologies, automation and artificial intelligence are dismantling and opening up profit opportunities in the welfare state in the United States. But in 2021, with Alexandra Matiscu, I edited a special series for The Guardian called Automating Care. And in our introduction to the series, we argued that this was less like care robots entering homes and much more like invisible pieces of code and webcams and algorithms that allocate care resources, manage and surveil caring labor, and guide crucial decisions about the future. So automated care has emerged for all the reasons that have already been laid out today. So poor investment in care infrastructure, the state's refusal of its duty of care, racist, classist, and nativist devaluation of care labor, and also capitalist exploitation and extraction, or hyper-capitalist exploitation and extraction, perhaps. But I want to talk today specifically about kinship care, and that means care that is done mostly by family members or close friends who may be paid or unpaid. That often fills the gaps between the withdrawal of state care and the market. An example of how automation is emerging in kinship care is a tool that some of you might already be familiar with called electronic visit verification, or EVV. Does anyone already know about EVV? Oh, okay, hi.
Prisons.
Quickly, in 2016, the Obama administration enacted the 21st Century Cures Act and tucked into its 12,006th paragraph was a requirement for all states to implement electronic visit verification for Medicaid-covered personal care services by January 2019, and for home health care services by January 2023. So this is now a requirement across the country. And at first blush, and for many policymakers, it seemed like common sense, sort of an upgrade to current procedures. So move, and in this case, I'll talk about family care workers, move their timesheets from paper to a cell phone app to increase accountability, ease administrative burden, eliminate fraud and abuse, and better track how caregivers spend their time. So I chose to report this story for The Guardian in Arkansas, which, like its neighbors Louisiana and Mississippi, is mostly rural with an aging population, with some of the lowest wages and highest turnover in care work professions in the country. It is probably not accidental that Arkansas has also been one of the states that has been most aggressively pursued things like Medicaid waivers to allow family members to be reimbursed for care work in the home. Yeah, and it's a complicated story. Like, it's both a very good thing and it's a very exploitative relationship. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. So here's the narrative that most EVV systems have been rolled out under in Arkansas and elsewhere. So there's a care crisis. We have to do more with less, and that's why we automate. And I wanted to ask, going into Arkansas, in that context, does EVV and tools like that make sense? And I'm just gonna say a little bit about 3 things I found there, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit about my personal experience as a kinship caregiver. So electronic visit verification ended up leading to more reporting work and less time for family members. So rather than easing administrative burdens for care workers, the inflexibility of the tools themselves both increased sort of arbitrary reporting and made crucial labor really invisible. So I talked to a woman named Nancy Morell, who's a paid family caregiver outside of Eureka Springs, who was caring for both her aging mother and her older sister, Carolyn, who has cerebral palsy. So though she lives with them both, provides 24/7 care, Nancy actually has to clock in and out of this application 4 times a day. Every time she switches between personal care and attendant care duties, even though her sister gets help whenever she needs it and not on a predetermined schedule. And because her 80-year-old mother, who is Carolyn's legal representative, has to authorize each shift, she actually has to also sort of force her mom to sign this tiny box on a cell phone app 4 times a day, which has created like really immense family tension. So Carolyn wrote a complaint letter to Arkansas Department of Human Services that said this administrative burden for her meant less care for her sister. She said, what took a total of 15 seconds in the past to sign a timesheet and submit it now takes many hours, hours that should be given to the client for care. And then to add insult to injury, her first paycheck under the new EVV regime was 3 weeks late. When she logged onto the website to find out why it was delayed, she saw that the system had red flagged all 16 of her shifts for that time period as incorrect. In the prior 13 years that she had worked for her sister, she'd only ever had 2 shifts red flagged in 13 years. And in the first 2 weeks of this program, all 16 of her shifts were flagged as incorrect. Okay, so second point around electronic visit verification. So for clients with disabilities, EVV felt like less of a digital timesheet and more like an ankle monitor. So I visited with Melissa Harville and Kevin Hoover of Greenbrier, and they pointed out this invisible line on their property, this line that they felt like they couldn't cross. Because many electronic visit verification applications incorporate GPS to location stamp a home care worker's shift, and also a feature called geofencing, which establishes a maximum distance around a client's home inside which a care worker is allowed to clock in and out. So Melissa is Kevin's partner as well as his caregiver, and she took me on a tour of the property, and she used the EVV app as we walked around to say like, oh, I can step here, but I can't step here. Like I can step there, but I can't step here. Like, oh, here I'm at work. Here I'm AWOL from work. So the two of them characterized the system as quote, an invisible dog fence for humans. And she said, it's like living in a box. So for more than 6 decades in the US, disability justice activists have asserted the right to autonomy over your own life and your ability to live, work, and receive services in the broader community. And geofencing and electronic visit verification is built on a premise that contradicts this. It assumes that people like Kevin, who loves to fish, he loves to work on cars, he plays music with his friends, it assumes that people like Kevin are homebound, not living active and vibrant lives. And it assumes that Melissa, his caregiver and partner, that she only provides services inside their home, even though her actual service plan includes things like doctor's visits, grocery shopping, and all sorts of things that happen away from home. So for-profit care wants to use the cheapest labor, in short, but it doesn't trust the worst paid workers. And tools like electronic visit verification increases digital surveillance on workers and also on their clients as well. So finally, the third point I want to make about EVV quickly is that how am I doing on time?
Oh, you're
Hafiza?
good.
Okay. There's a third danger sort of on the horizon with electronic visit verification, which I think aligns a lot with Dr. Nadasen's work, which is the systems that I studied. And I got invited into a lot of agencies to look at the way the back end of these tools work. And what I saw is that currently, care workers and kinship care workers are clocking in and out of shifts, but the technology already exists to have them instead check in and out of tasks. And the difference here is really important because what this means is if we move to checking in and out of tasks, then you can use that data as an output, that output data as an input to algorithms that assign care hours under Medicaid. And there has already been a huge dust up around this in Arkansas before EVV was rolled out. So EVV could end up prioritizing countable care, making relational care non-reimbursable. What that means is giving meds and toileting, if that's on your task list, you can clock in and out of doing those tasks. But things like talking about the news or like, playing cards after dinner, that stuff's not on your task list, so you don't get paid for that. So care workers will then be left with these impossible choices. Either refuse to do the harder to measure labors of love, or continue to give quality care and see your pay rate just crater. So all of my work as a scholar and as a journalist and as a personal essayist most recently really has to do with sort of the historical and the structural contexts in which automation like this emerges. But I also am really interested in the effects that the very real material and emotional effects that these tools have on people's lives day to day. And it seems unfair of me to not report that as I was reporting these stories and writing these stories, I was also going through a caregiving crisis at home. So my much beloved partner of 18 years, Jason, endured 2 violent attacks at the end of 2015, which resulted in a severe and chronic case of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that night in the ER, Jason got no screening for or information about traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. We got no referral to a social worker or to victim services. In fact, the hospital turfed him out to chairs to wait hours before his dad was able to come pick him up. So after the swelling in his face went down, Jason underwent 6.5 hours of plastic surgery, and the hospital refused to keep him overnight. Instead, they gave me a set of wire clippers and told me that if the pain or the anesthetic made him sick at home, I should cut the wires holding his jaws together so he didn't aspirate on his own vomit. The next morning, it continues to get bad for a while. The next morning, I went to the pharmacy to fill his pain meds prescription, and we were told we no longer had health insurance. As far as I could find out, because they won't give me clear answers on this, they had suspended us to investigate us for insurance fraud. Once we got the insurance back, we were lucky to get Jason to a great trauma therapist, and we had incredible support from our community. But his mental health continued to decline, and by 2019, we tried and failed to get him into a behavioral health crisis center. With our inpatient options exhausted, we went to a local hospital's outpatient clinic to ask for more help, and the intake worker said to us, and this is a direct quote, "You have private insurance? Then why are you here?" The shocking thing is we've actually had it pretty good. The median time to treatment in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder is 12 years. Jason was in therapy within months. I'm a researcher and a journalist with a fair amount of discretionary time and with skills that I could use to figure out what was going on in this sort of situation and how to fix it. In the end, we relied on our community. We invented a sort of all-volunteer, all-amateur psych ward in our living room. And while we got him stabilized, he lost his job. And the whole process, of course, took a huge toll on him, on me, on our relationship, on our community. And quickly, I do want to say that the care penalty is financial, but it is also an incalculable loss of human potential. And this is mostly what I think about when I think about what the world has lost because we chose not to support Jason in one of the worst times of his life. He's an extraordinary human being with a lot to offer the world. So I want to say, if I have one more minute, I'm still good?
You got to wrap.
Okay, I got to wrap. I just want to talk about hope really quickly. I think the first thing that we need to think about is centering universal access. Often when we talk about automation, we talk about triage. Triage is really only appropriate if there are more resources coming eventually. And what we're doing is actually rationing, not triage, and we should talk about it as what it is. Second, we need to start from the dignity of poor and working class families, patients and caregivers, and care professionals. We all have crucial knowledge and expertise that's obscured and erased by these technologies. And we need to center sufficiency and plan for abundance. When we plan for scarcity, we produce scarcity. Finally, the very last thing I want to say, thank you for your patience, is that we need to center storytelling. My greatest fear is that by relying on robot caregivers or eligibility algorithms, we allow government and technology companies to shrink the complex and significant problems we face as a society to fit the narrow box that's available through technological solutions. So I'm going to suggest that one of the best remedies for bad data is better stories. And we can start by making the labors of love visible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Virginia. I am going to move directly to our next speaker because we have two more. Bonita. Okay, hold on, let me introduce first. Bonita Lawrence was a professor in Indigenous Studies for 25 years before retiring this year. Her work focuses, Her work focuses on Native identity struggles, which have their roots in an intergenerational attack on Native motherhood, involving the historical and continuing theft of Native children to the child welfare system in Canada, as well as the residential school system which preceded it, which you are going to discuss today, Native child welfare in Canada.
Okay. Hi, everybody, and it's lovely to be here, and I really appreciate all the work that went into this conference. Although I have been a professor in child welfare, my whole interest in Native child welfare comes from a more personal process. My mother was a single mother. She's Mi'kmaq on one side and French on the other. She managed to leave my father with incredible struggle, but that meant that she had to raise 5 of us on her own. And living out in the country meant she had to walk 2 miles to the highway every morning and back every night. 100-degree weather in summer, 30 below zero in winter. She had to do that to raise us. And of course, she had, 3 daughters at home. 2 of us were small. While this was happening, I was farmed out because we didn't have kindergarten. So until I was 6 and could go to school, I was just farmed out around. But she had older people to make sure they were at home for when welfare came. And because she had to, didn't make a lot of money, everything had to go on rent, heating, and electricity, and a phone to make sure that she didn't appear to be in crisis. And that meant there wasn't a lot left for food. My mother pretty much had to charm the local grocery guy into kind of fronting her the money, basically allowing her to get food when the house was empty once a week. So she managed to keep child welfare away. And as I grew older, I realized that part of it was that we lived in an area on the south shore of Montreal that had very few Native people around. There was a Ganawagi Reserve, which was further south. Most of the people at many of the people at Ganawagi look like I do because they used to kidnap English people when they lost too many people at war. But but they weren't looking for Native people. So my mother was able to get away with a lot. If we had been 100 miles further north, which is really kind of the line between Native and white, we would have been taken. There's no question. The other thing, of course, that being a single mother with 5 kids, and then my oldest sister got drafted into supporting the family at the age of 16. She had to keep moving every year to smaller and smaller places, and it seemed every time we moved, we lost a sibling. I mean, there was 5 of us kids, soon there was 4, there was 3, then there was 2, and there was just me and my sister out at work. They were all out at work. So I just left home. It was, you know, the loss of the family, just because everybody had to keep leaving because we were in tiny little apartments, was, I think, the hardest thing for me. But so it meant that within a few months of leaving home, I was introduced to shooting methamphetamine. And that's how I got to know a lot of Native people on the street. Now, I had a terrible identity crisis around that, because if my mother was Native and French, who were we? I mean, the 2 oldest, you know, at least were olive-skinned. But if you look like us, how can you be Native? My mother understood some Mi'kmaq, but her first language was French. We grew up speaking English. We lost 2 languages in a generation. So understanding identity issues became very difficult. But most of my knowledge of child welfare came from everybody that I met on the street, basically. So then I, in some ways, 3 years in wages for housework. I got sent to England when I was 19 because my father suddenly entered my life. He wanted me to pick up a relative and leave, and the relative died, so I stayed. Wages for housework kind of helped me to straighten out for a little while. It didn't last. By the time I left England, there was a heroin epidemic that was not, you know, my mother and my sister got me home, but the point is that the child welfare issue wasn't something just that I studied, but something that I first encountered. Only university helped me to understand the parameters. So I want to talk about that, and I'm sorry I'm talking fast, but I'm aware that there's a huge number of things to cover and not very much time. So anyway, I guess the difference in Canada and the US is that residential schools started a little later in Canada, but they went on much, much later. They were phasing out residential schools in the 60s and 70s. A lot were still available around in the 80s, and the last one closed in the 90s. And what that meant, of course, is that, like, it sort of made a difference in residential school is now well known in Canada. It's only starting to be known about here. We had an Indian residential settlement agreement, you know. Canada started phasing out residential schools, I think, only because of the Genocide Convention, because to take children of a minority by the state is actual genocide under the convention. Now, massacres and planned diseases could be the past, but this is genocide in the present. So I think that's why they phased out residential schools for the child welfare system. And that began in 1950s, less than 1% of children in care were Native. They began in the 60s, they called it the 60s Scoop, and that's who all the people I met on the street were part of. The 60s Scoop, social workers were known to drive onto reserves with school buses to take the kids away. 20,000 kids were taken within the first year or so, and the Scoop continued. The Spalongene Reserve in British Columbia lost 150 children, all of that generation. There were no more kids to take, right? And that happened on a couple of other reserves too, but that was the most noticeable. Parents tried to fight back, but the problem was the legacy of residential school. The birth of a live Indian in Canada means that you are a ward of the state. So that meant that if parents tried to keep their kids from residential school, they could be arrested, and many were. So when these child welfare people started taking the kids, it was really hard to fight back, because that was the history. That's what people knew, you know? As I say, in the 50s, less than 1% of children in care were Native. By the 70s, depending on how many children in each province, between 30 and 60% of children in care were Native. In Northern Ontario, north of that 100 miles north from where we grew up, 90% of the kids in care were Native. So how were they allowed to get away with this, right? First of all was the massive racism against Native mothers. In the past, and by the 1880s, any Native woman found off reserve could be legally classified as a prostitute and dealt accordingly, right? So in Canada, Native people on reserves are governed, or anybody with recognized Indian status. The government recognizes you as an Indian, which doesn't mean a lot of us are non-status. There's something called the Indian Act, which is a huge body of laws that governs Native people. And it keeps being modified years after years, but it's always the Indian Act. So anyway, under the racist classifications of the Indian Act meant that Native women were seen as degenerate. There's a whole lot of other racist things I could say, and I'm not going to say them. But basically, the idea was Native women were incapable of raising their own children. And social workers had those biases. Second thing, Indian Affairs would only pay in-care costs for Native children. At the time, white families could have help if they were in crisis, so they wouldn't lose their kids. But for Native children, all Canada would pay for is for the children to be removed. That is paying white families. And in that respect, it's like many of people's stories here, right? And the third thing, social workers did not differentiate between poverty and child abuse or neglect. Now, there was an issue. Residential schools raised completely traumatized adults, physically and sexually abused, and no experience of living in families. For those people, their children were at best over-disciplined, at worst abused and neglected. But that was one slice. Many families had adults working, the parents were out working out of town, finding jobs to work to support the kids. The children were being raised by their grandparents with love, but they were poor, so they were taken. There is other phenomenal ways in which Native children could be taken. First of all, I'm going to try and find a page. First of all, schools in the north, that 100-mile north thing. If you, schools in areas of high Native concentration, if a child showed up even once in the winter, not properly dressed, you know, not a hat, not gloves, whatever, teachers were legally required to report them to child welfare, and that child would be taken. And it didn't matter what the teacher, you know, if the teacher was sympathetic, it didn't matter. That was the law. You had to report them. So kids were taken that way. I can't say how often we would have been taken. The other one was that if a mother had been in care in the hospital when she gave birth, the baby was taken because children who'd been in care may have had chaotic lives. The assumption was a mother who had grown up in care was incapable of raising her own children, so they were taken. So there's an intergenerational taking of Native children going on, you know. So the power differential between white authorities and Native people, the colonial differential, was so huge in those days. A friend of mine told me that her sister was taken from her mother just because her mother wasn't married when she was born. The nuns took the child, told her that if she got married within a year, she could have her child back. My friend's mother had to travel almost 1,000 miles from Edmonton to Toronto, where her husband was working, convince her to marry him, find a place to live in Toronto, and then trek back to Edmonton. By then it was a year. She got her child back. The child didn't know her and had never bonded. And that meant that in that family, my friend always said that the child was ill all the time. She had all kinds of allergies and other problems and low self-esteem and depression that none of the other children had. But that was the result. Now, few of the children taken into white families were prepared to love them. Social workers and people who did genuinely want Native children because they couldn't have children, they were shocked by the way that welfare workers would bring, say, a couple of Native children, I think you want children, and they'd say, okay, they expected to have them come back again, and the child would visit again, see if they bonded and everything. No, they were dumped. They said, take them now, right? So, and that really, but the point is, most of the families, they wanted Native kids for a lot of reasons. Obviously, they wanted the kids for the money, but many farm families, because it was still agricultural in a lot of days then, they wanted poorly fed farm workers. They wanted farm workers, so they were poorly fed, and it's not my story to tell. It's somebody who was a really good friend of mine. But when I met her, she was having her nose rebuilt because the woman she lived with had smashed her in the face so often that her nose had been broken far too often. The other thing she told me that resonated for years with me, it didn't resonate personally, but it shocked me, is the woman made her shit outside. White toilets were for white people. So you have, and the worse than that was, of course, abusers. They had a field day. They could take Native children, they were living in their homes. Nobody believed the word of a foster child. That friend who had her nose broken and the rest of it, because she showed up in such bad shape at school, sympathetic teachers would sort of say, are you okay? And they had to go back. The family had good standing in the community, so there was no outlet. And one of her sisters committed suicide because she was in a place where she was just sexually abused too often. Now, when children were adolescents and started fighting back, 90% of these adoptions broke down, leaving young people on the street without supervision, not knowing where they were or where they came from. This is where I met most of the people. They made up most of the street prostitutes, male and female, as well as those most trafficked. They're one reason why Native youth suicide is considered to be the highest in the world in Canada. The survivors have filled Canada's prisons. In some prisons, 100% of the people are Native and 100% come from the child welfare system. I'm just going to very briefly say a former boyfriend of mine who was sexually and physically abused as a child left the family at 15 and was on his own. When he was 17 and traveled to Winnipeg, he met somebody on the street who tried to pick him up, and he flashed back to the abuse of his child, and when he came out of it, he had kicked the man to death. So at the age of 17, he was tried for murder and went to prison. He came out at 39 and entered a halfway house, and by 44 began his life. He was a brilliant man. He's still alive, but along with that kind of thing, your health bottoms out all the time. But he went to university. I met him when I was teaching at Queen's, and I never met such a brilliant man, and this had been his life. He's
Nita,
still out of prison.
Can we come back?
I have to go soon.
Oh, okay.
I have to finish soon, right? I'm going to try and
You wrap, okay.
longer. Yeah. So anyway, 2017, a handful of survivors of the 60s scoop, as this was called, won a class action suit. None of the Native organizations backed it, in part because of the role of the state. They had organized the process, but the role of the state was hidden behind each child apprehended. The state was invisible, so it was hard to back it. Residential school, you knew who the enemy was, right? So anyway, so survivors of the 60s scoop, they got 25,000, each. And a third of them were rejected because, of course, when you're adopted, you're not told where you come from. And how do you then find out where you are and then apply for Indian status? Because you're only available if you're a status Indian. So a third of the people lost it. I know your brains are tired and I'm running out of time, but there's just a couple of details left.
Can we come back to it in the discussion if we have time for it? We got Alissa.
Can you give me just 2 more minutes?
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Well, it's just that it's a different process now from this on, anyway. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. The millennial scoop is on now, and the issue with the millennial scoop, we couldn't have a Native child welfare law in Canada. We don't have the sovereignty. But, so there has been more kids in prison, scoop now than then. But I'll just 2 seconds more.
Okay, just go ahead.
Just 2 seconds more, because it really is just 2 seconds more.
Okay.
The difference with the 60 scoop and what's happening now is there's more Native people who got treaty rights to education so they could fight the system. And there's child welfare organizations, Native child welfare, that tried to help but were underfunded, so they couldn't do much. They won a settlement that this Native First Nations Child Caring Society, took them years and years because Canada kept reneging on it. They basically won a settlement that provides compensation to on-reserve Native people who were removed from their home between 1991, the end of the 60 scoop, and 2022, which is the millennial scoop. Native child welfare is now on an equal footing with Children's Aid, which they should. That's the only way of fighting it, having them, right? So with more help, they can stop getting the kids apprehended and house them better and everything else. The settlement provides compensation to Native, I'll talk about Jordan's principle later. The important thing was the settlement for everybody who was adopted includes funding compensation to the caregivers, their parents or grandparents, really mothers and grandmothers, whose children were taken away and whose children may be returned now with this settlement. So that's why I just wanted to say this at the end. Right? There was a happy ending. There was a happy ending. Thank you. Okay. Apologies for being so long.
Okay, wonderful. Our final speaker, Alissa, I think you are going to close us out here, who is joining us on Zoom. Alissa Trotz is Professor of Caribbean Studies at New College and Director of the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Her current research looks at diaspora, indigeneity, and extractivism in colonial Guyana. Now, Alissa, did you want to talk about the time you survey or whatever you want to talk about? It's okay.
Sure. Can everyone?
Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I'm really sorry. I am unable to cross the border at this time to be with you all. I'm joining you from Toronto, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of Credit. I want to thank all of the organizers and everyone for all of the labor and love that has made this possible. It has been a real privilege just hearing not just the hard stories, but the determination, courage, and hope of all of the panelists this morning. I've been reading Emily Kalachi's incredible book, Wages for Housework. I'm glad that Emily is with you there. And I want to thank her for really emphasizing the importance of grounding our politics in the lived experiences of the unwaged, of making that clear link between study and organizing. And this morning, Salma, who I'm most sad not to be with in person, called us to, quote, evaluate our own lives and decide how we want to live, end quote. And we heard from the welfare warriors, we heard from Leddy, we heard from Sister Bonita's hopeful ending just now, why organizing matters and what it can actually do. So in my brief time, I want to share quickly the work of Red Thread, a grassroots women's organization in Guyana that was started in 1986 as a deliberate response to deep racial divisions in the country. Red Thread also formed in opposition to the domination of politics by political parties, something you're used to in the United States right now, which focus on loyalty and on redirecting or misdirecting our energies to winning elections and capturing state power for a few of us, instead of focusing our energies on building a movement that can win power for all of us. So today, the Red Thread Corps consists mainly of a multiracial group of grassroots women, which advocates primarily to cross divides and transform conditions of marginalization, and which emphasizes the self-organizing capacity of grassroots women. Between 2001 and 2002, Red Thread carried out a 13-month-long time use survey, counting all of the care work done predominantly by women. This survey actually started accidentally because things were actually not going well at the Red Thread Center. Work was not getting done, And one of the coordinators, the late social activist Andaye, who has worked closely with the global strike, called a meeting to express her frustration. And the women said, look, we're tired. It might look as if we're coming in and doing nothing. It might look as if we're wasting time, but physically and emotionally, we have nothing to give. And so they decided to record what exactly are you doing when you're not at Red Thread, so that we could actually get a sense, an audit of how people's time was being spent. And having done this, what was so remarkable was that this care work had been so invisible, even to Red Thread ourselves. And this recognition, understanding how much care work the women were doing, and also seeing how much care work each other was doing, this really shifted things. And the next step was to decide upon a countrywide survey that was developed with Wages for Housework. And here I want to really give props to Solveig Francis in particular for all the work. This was long before all of this internet that made the technology so much swifter. I think Skype was then coming in. So it was really painstaking work across international borders. The grassroots women interviewed 100 grassroots women up and down the country, African, Indian, and Indigenous, and collected a total of 151 days of diaries. There are three significant things about this survey. One is just the labor that it actually took. So this was also a huge journey of care work. The grassroots women did it themselves, getting sick along the way, having to find folks to care for their loved ones when they were traveling, moving to other parts of the country, sleeping on the road when the buses broke down, trying to get to hinterland communities to meet Indigenous women, the work of persuading other women to get involved, the work of working around reluctant and in some cases confronting abusive partners, the work of having to interrupt the time use survey to intervene where that was necessary. The second was, and this was with Solveig and the Wages for Housework encouragement, was for the first time counting emotional work. So not just counting what people were doing, not just counting the simultaneous work of cooking while, having a baby on your lap, but also asking the women, you went to bed. How long did it take you to get to sleep? Why? What were you thinking about? What were you worrying about? So trying to find a way of mapping the emotional and mental work that I think Virginia spoke about in her presentation. And the third thing is that these were not researchers coming to study something that had nothing to do with them. These were grassroots women who were living and experiencing what they were finding out. So they were not outsiders, they were participating. Where the women were too busy, they joined in to help cook, help wash clothes, help hang clothes on the line. Where women could not read or write, they helped to do the journals themselves. They helped out with household work. They shared their advice and knowledge. A couple of things coming out of this. One, this work was very important in making connections and building relationships across race and geography, women getting to see each other and listen to each other in real time. Secondly, it refocused Red Thread's work. A lot more emphasis went in, for example, to working on things like gender-based violence, and particularly an emphasis on advocating for a living income for waged and unwaged workers. Many of the Red Thread women are domestic workers or former domestic workers, and thinking about Leddy's presentation, this has become a really big part of what Red Thread does, advocating with other women across the Caribbean, including the women out of Trinidad who have worked with the global strike. It has had a profound impact on Red Thread's work and organizing, although at the time it was not so clear. And just to give a few quick examples, in 2005, when we had massive floods that displaced about 30% of the population in the country, women came to the Red Thread Crossroads Center for support. Red Thread actually used a time use methodology to pull everyone into line when racism was getting in the way of seeing what the women actually shared in their losses. And in fact, what it ended up leading to was the women coming together to advocate successfully to refuse the government's responses to compensation that calculated compensation in a way that did not count women's unwaged work. And the women were able to advocate and get the government to have to rethink how they calculated compensation. They have used Red Thread. Red Thread has used time use to count budgets in order to successfully advocate for the removal of the value-added tax on essential household items. They have used time use to successfully advocate for things like higher pensions for our elders in the Caribbean. And right now, in the work that is happening on the oil and gas industry, where Exxon has made one of the largest discoveries in recent times and is making all of its profits on the basis of the oil that's being produced in Guyana, counting time and money has been essential for Red Thread in its work to begin a campaign that shows how little of this so-called wealth of extractivism is trickling down to grassroots people. Virginia ended by saying the remedy for bad data is better stories. And Selma ended by saying, quote, we have to think about the life we want to live as opposed to the life we find ourselves living. I'll simply close with the words of Red Thread, quote, we intend to continue to use time use as a basis for developing an understanding and communication among women of different race and ethnic groups of what we have in common as providers of unwaged and or low-wage caring labor and what we are entitled to, must demand, and can only together win as providers of this labor on which the survival of the whole society and economy depend. Time use is a way of thinking, is a way of organizing across communities and across difference. We begin counting what we do, which is a way of identifying who we are, understanding why we matter, learning about each other beyond the stereotypes and boxes we like to put each other in. And 20 years later, we are still doing it. Thank you.
We are at 12:45. However, I'm scared to ask you is there a closing remark? Like just a single thing that you would like, we can just go really quickly. Bonita, really quickly.
I guess the focus the focus on child welfare was really, to my mind, about what happened to the mothers. And that's why the final thing with the Millennial Scoop in winning recognition for the caregivers. So many of the mothers never made it out of the 60 Scoop. That was the reality. But now with the Millennial Scoop, they were able to get reimbursement for caregivers. And that, I think, is the most important. Thank you.
Bien rapidito. Solo quiero agregar que nuestra ley protege a las migrantes y a las nacionales. Y además, para contratar una trabajadora del hogar tiene que tener 18 años de edad. Ya no menor, ya no van a pasar como nosotras que trabajamos muy niñas. Eso. Nada más. Poquito me dijeron.
I just want to add that our law also protects immigrants, and that in order to hire a domestic worker, you need to be 18 years old. Minors cannot hire a domestic worker.
So I just want to say a couple things, if that's okay. I'm going to say, I'm a historian. I'm a historian of social change. And one of the things I've learned in my study of history is a change does not come from the top down. Yeah. It comes from the bottom up. I think this is really important in this moment to think about when so much is coming out of the White House in this country, right? When we look back historically, change has not happened because Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy or anyone else decided to sign a piece of legislation, Abraham Lincoln, right? It came because of people who were organizing on the ground. And so I think we need to keep that in mind as we move forward vis-a-vis the care economy and extraction of care. And the other thing I want to say is that part of the takeaway, I think, of everything I've heard this morning so far is really about the importance of racial capitalism, of settler colonialism, imperialism, expropriation, and understanding care. So we cannot only think about care vis-a-vis gender and the gender division of labor in the household, right? It means that we have to begin our analysis of care from the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who are the poorest, and I would argue our politics of thinking about care is not only about work, it's not only about care work, it's also about people who cannot work. It's about people who are unhoused. It's about people who don't have food. It's not that we have to expand our notion and our definition of care and who should be cared for to be much more inclusive and not center it around work and not center it around even necessarily who's a mother or who's a parent. It really should be a care system for everyone who needs support.
I'm grateful to be here, and I cede my time to lunch.
And for me to close, I just want to again echo and honor Selma. We must organize to win. We are fueled by anger, but we are powered by love and joy. I hear laughter and humor, and that's a big part of what this movement is also about. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry I can't join you.
Round of applause. Panel, thank you.